Hello everyone and welcome back to another Woowa video. As of me recording this, Yinlin was just released on live a few hours ago and I've been having a blast playing her. Her kit is a bit more involved than some others, but she's fun to play, beautiful, strong, and can fit into various team comps. I'll be covering some considerations for pulling her and some reasons not to, as well as her kit, builds, gameplay, and team comps. Keep in mind that Yinlin was just released, so some things may change over time as new tech is discovered and metas evolve. Yinlin is a very offense-forward sub-DPS that deals damage off-screen, as well as buffing your carry's electro and resonance liberation damage. However, if you get her 6th sequence, she can become a great main DPS as well. Her main strengths are her electro and liberation damage buffs, ability to deal damage off-screen, great animations, high base crit, and high AoE damage. Some cons are that she generally wants to get off a full basic attack combo every time she's on the field, on top of the standard skill plus echo usage, making her take slightly more on-screen time than other sub-DPS. Also, characters that aren't electro or liberation damage based will not benefit from her outro's buff. With those in mind, let's talk about whether or not you should pull for her, starting with some reasons why you should. Number 1, you want her. Let's be honest, this is the most important thing in the game, so if you really like the character, whether it be her aesthetics, kit, or both, I support you and you should go for it. 2. You really enjoy using your Calcaro. Yinlin is without a doubt the strongest support for Calcaro, granting him both electro damage amplify and increased liberation damage, which accounts for more than half of his damage output. 3. You're lacking AoE on your teams. Yinlin has strong AoE and can provide a lot while off the field, so if you're using single target focused characters, it's something worth considering. And 4. You have a massive bankroll and plan to get her S6 and weapon. Unlocking her 6th sequence converts her from a strong sub DPS to a very dominant main DPSer. The numbers look strong and she should be able to stand toe to toe with other 5-star main carries with no problems. On the other hand, here are some reasons you should consider not pulling for her. 1. You don't have any electro or liberation DPS to pair her with. Since her outro skill primarily focuses on buffing those damage types, not having a good partner will greatly reduce what she brings to the table on a team. 2. You don't have a weapon for her. People using a character like Encore will find themselves needing 3 different rectifiers when pairing with Yinlin. Since she's a very damage forward support, you'll want to have a good 4-star weapon as a bare minimum for her, or you'll likely find her to be kind of lackluster in damage. 3. Her base damage numbers aren't particularly amazing. For a limited 5-star unit, her base numbers, when not modified by sequences, aren't particularly eye-catching. Although perfectly serviceable as a sub-DPS for anyone at S0 with a 4-star weapon, if you don't have an exceptionally synergistic teammate like Calcaro, I think it's worth considering saving your Astrite for something else in the future. Of course, take everything I say with a grain of salt, but for a mostly free-to-play player like myself, I suggest taking some of my points into consideration before going all out. Alright, with that all said and done, let's cover her kit. As with all characters, her kit revolves around her forte circuit, which in her case is Chameleon Cypher. Her judgment gauge is filled when hitting enemies with her basic attacks, Magnetic Roar, Electromagnetic Blast, or Lightning Execution. Once full, you can hold basic attack to cast Chameleon Cypher, which will consume all of the gauge to deal damage in a massive AoE around you. Enemies that have a Sinner's Mark from getting hit by your basic attacks, intro skill, or ultimate will have their marks changed into a punishment mark. When attacked, enemies with Punishing Mark will suffer Judgment Strike damage from Yinlin, granting her energy per hit. Unfortunately, at the moment, we don't know what damage boost Chameleon Cypher is affected by, so it currently only is known to scale with Electro damage boost. Her basic attack combo is a 4-part chain that sends out her puppet and hits short to medium range targets while generating gauge. Although the 3rd part does flip you backwards, it won't move you off edges, so don't worry about falling off cliffs. The heavy attack is a circular AoE around her that deals a small amount of damage, but generates a respectable amount of gauge. It's a really good way to apply Sinner's Mark on enemies around you, and if you ever find yourself slightly short on gauge, this can be a good way to fill it up and finish your rotation. Her mid-air attack is a heel kick that drops straight down, but it has about the same horizontal reach as her basic attacks. It generates a small amount of gauge and will likely not get used much outside of just helping her get to the ground quickly. The dodge counter is a multi-hit attack that also generates a small amount of gauge. As with most characters, hitting the dodge counter will allow you to start from part 3 of your basic attack chain. In addition, all of her basic attacks will apply Sinner's Mark on enemies hit. Her resident skill, Magnetic Roar, is a 2-part skill that also modifies her basic attacks. Upon use, it'll deal damage in an area in front of her, and if used again within 10 seconds, will allow you to cast Lightning Execution, which deals even more damage in a wider area and marks all enemies hit with Sinner's Mark. In addition, Magnetic Roar will buff your next 4 auto attacks to generate extra judgment. For the cherry on top, if you have her inherent skill, Pain Immersion learned, she'll gain a substantial 15% crit chance for 5 seconds after both Magnetic Roar and Lightning Execution. Her Resonance Liberation is a wide area multi-hit attack with decent damage that also applies Sinner's Mark to enemies hit. Unlike some others, her Liberation does not freeze time for the full duration, so you can actually use it as a great way to dodge some annoying attacks from bosses. Her intro skill, Raging Storm, deals damage and also applies Sinner's Mark to all enemies hit. Her outro skill, Strategist, is a powerful buff that grants the next character 20% electro damage amplify and 25% resonance liberation damage. It really shines with characters that can utilize both, but you can still use it on non-electro teams. Yinlin has some great sequences to boost her damage, with her S6 allowing her to completely shift roles. Her S1 offers a 70% increase in damage to her 2 skill activations, Magnetic Roar and Lightning Execution. S2 is a utility sequence that gives her skill-empowered autos, 5 extra judgment and energy on hit, making it easier for her kit to flow. S3 is the first huge node for her, granting an additional 55% damage multiplier to her Judgment Strike procs, which ends up being about a 22% damage increase from her S2. S4 is a 100% uptime, team-wide attack buff similar to the ones that supports get, and S5 basically doubles the damage of her ult. Her S6 unlocks her ability to be a main DPS by giving her 4 empowered basic attacks following every single ult. The empowered basics get 420% attack as skill damage, adding about 1,680% damage to each of her cycles, which is impressive to say the least. Yinlin has 2 build paths depending on your investment level. For most, building her with Moonlit Clouds will be the recommended choice, especially if you're pairing her with a strong main DPS. If you have some sequences and a good weapon, using Void Thunder set and focusing heavily on her personal damage becomes an option as well. Whichever set you go for, the primary and substat build options are almost identical. For 4 costs, you'll be taking crit rate or damage depending on your stats. Remember, you're aiming for a 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage ratio. To calculate this, subtract 100 from the crit damage you see on your attribute page, and compare it with your crit rate. If you're not a fan of the nerdy math stuff, in most cases, if you don't have a crit rate weapon, you'll want a crit rate 4 cost. For 3 costs, you'll want to go for electro damage. If you have a lot of damage bonus modifiers, you can also potentially take an attack percentage echo over an electro damage one. And for 1 cost, take attack percent. For substats, you'll want to take crit rate and damage on every echo, followed by attack percent and flat attack. For the 5th slot, skill and liberation damage percent are very close in value, and they're a similar percentage of your damage, but keep in mind that if info on the damage type of Chameleon Cypher is released, this will change. For her weapon, both 5-star options work well, but her signature weapon Stringmaster is about 10 to 20% better than the standard Cosmic Ripples, making it the best DPS weapon for her by far. Competitive 4-star options include the Battle Pass's Augment and Jinzo Keeper, with the former being ever so slightly better at S1, but significantly stronger at S5. If you can't get your hands on any of the previous 4 weapons, the 3-star Rectifier of Night can be used to tie you over until you get an upgrade. While looking at rotations, you might see people mentioning swap cancelling to improve her DPS. Okay, let me briefly dive into and explain why I don't recommend swap cancelling the vast majority of the time. Swap cancelling refers to starting an animation of some kind and swapping characters without activating an outro skill, or sometimes while doing it. In Yinlin's case, the swap cancelable animations are her skills, echo, or part 4 of her basic attack chain. Done correctly, it'll allow the previous animation to continue while allowing you to act on the next character. After swapping, you usually perform an action or skill, then immediately swap back and continue with whatever rotation you were doing on the previous character. In the past, this had very little drawback since outro skill buffs would last the full duration and not drop even if you swap between characters. However, with the live version of the game, outro skill buffs drop if you swap off the character. Which brings me to my first issue with swap cancelling being overly prevalent in rotations. Swap cancelling will generally make you drop your outro buffs. Next character type outro buffs from resonators like, I don't know, let's pick a random one like Yinlin, drop when you swap. Meaning if you swap onto a carry with an outro and swap back, he completely loses that buff. Yinlin has an additional interaction with swapping which allows her to skip part 1 of her basic attack chain while swapping in. This is why you may see a swap cancel recommendation after her skill use on some rotations, and this brings me to my next point. You barely save any time. Swap cancelling saves a different amount of time depending on where you're using it, but for the vast majority of situations, it shaves a few frames at best. During the hectic chaos of combat, saving a few frames here and there sounds good, but if it comes with too many limitations and the benefits are only reaped in a perfect scenario, I don't really think it's worth it. Which brings me to my final point. Combat is very dynamic and learning frame-perfect rotations is virtually useless as you'll almost never be able to execute it. Next, let's talk about how swap cancelling can be applied to Yinlin's kit and what benefits you can reap when doing so. You can swap cancel the second half of her skill, Lightning Execution. The main benefit would be the ability to perform an extra action on another character and then swap back around the same time it would take for the animation to resolve. In addition, it allows you to continue from part 2 of her basic attack chain when swapping back. In similar fashion, part 4 of her basic attack chain can be swap cancelled to fit in an extra action during the longer animation of her attack. Chameleon Cypher is another target for swap cancelling, but for users of the Moonlit set, it's recommended to not do so, since you'll usually want to follow it up with Heron for the buff on your next character. Finally, Echo swap cancelling is a popular tech for almost every 4-cost Echo that does save a considerable amount of animation time, and is the only one I personally recommend using in your rotation. The most common issue you might run into while swap cancelling is since it's not realistic to always adhere to a strict rotation in combat, you'll frequently run into scenarios where you accidentally fill your gauge and use your outro, making it unavailable for later when it needs to line up with the DPS rotation. In any case, I'd like to reiterate that there are likely to be many more best rotations or best theoretic swap cancels, but at the end of the day, we're humans playing an action combat RPG, so stay on your toes, be adaptive, and focus on understanding why you're doing each of your actions. Also, if you're the type that does enjoy min-maxing and love doing frame-perfect inputs and theoretical bests, you should absolutely try and go for every beneficial swap cancel rotation that you find. My focus here isn't to alienate, but rather to try and lower the high bar of entry that some people associate with complicated tech in rotations. So, what do I recommend in the way of a rotation? Personally, I believe her gameplay execution is actually rather straightforward. Your goal when you swap to Yinlin is to use your skills, ulti, perform one enhanced basic auto chain, Chameleon Cypher, use your Heron, then swap with your outro. This generally translates to intro, skill, ult, skill, basic attack combo, Cypher, echo, outro. If you're using Tempest Mephis and the Void Thunder set, I recommend swapping the Cypher and echo order for more uptime on the punishment marks. Once you become more comfortable, then consider incorporating some swap cancelling into your rotation and see what works best for you. In order to ult on every cycle, you'll need to get a good amount of judgment strikes. If you swap to Yinlin and don't have ult, just move your basic attack combo into the position in the rotation and continue onward. Of course, this is just one possible rotation, and I'm sure many more will be discovered as time goes on, but in practice, you're really unlikely to be able to do the full rotation without having to alter something. Just remember to use your skill 2 times, and ulti in between skill uses if possible, fill your gauge with basic attacks, use your heavy, use your echo, and then swap out with your outro. I find that the flow of combat frequently forces me to dodge at around my second basic attack, which lets me follow my dodge counter with basic attack part 3 and 4, but there are plenty of times where I have to completely stop and do an extra basic attack or heavy attack here and there. As far as team comps go, we of course have to start with our all-star best in slot partner, Calcaro. Since he benefits from both our electro damage amplify and resonance liberation damage boost, Yinlin is his ideal sub DPS. Havoc MC and Chisha are actually decent alternatives as well, since they both hit frequently, proccing her judgment strikes, and also have strong resonance liberations. You could use characters that are off element and hit count focused, like Encore, Danjin, Lingyang, or Jian, but most of them are better off with another 4-star sub DPS that fits their archetype, like Sanhua or Mortefi. If using her as a main DPS, characters like Taochi, Yangyang, and Jianxian are all options, though if you went all out and got her S6, I would most certainly go with Taochi for her skill damage amp. And finally, as with most teams, her ideal support is Verena or Baishu, with the former being slightly better than the latter. And that's everything from me. I hope this video was helpful, and if you learned anything, please consider subscribing as it helps me out a lot. Leave a comment below with which Yinlin you prefer, and as always, have fun and best of luck with your pulls.